The story of Saint Augustine's conversion begins long before the decisive moment in the Garden of Milan. It is born from the tension between two worlds that shaped his childhood. On one side, the ardent and persevering faith of his mother, Saint Monica, whose trust in God was unshakable. On the other, the pagan and morally decadent environment of Roman society, to which his father, Patricius, was deeply integrated. From an early age, Augustine grew up as someone divided between the light of the gospel, which he did not yet understand, and the seductions of the world, which seemed fascinating and promising to him. His precocious intelligence impressed everyone, but his heart remained restless, seeking answers that no pagan philosophy could offer. Even in his youth, something within him already pulsed like a distant call, a silent movement of grace that only years later he would recognize as the work of God. Augustine's intellectual ambition led him to stand out quickly in his studies, especially in rhetoric, the art of persuading through words. In his brilliant mind, however, there was a mixture of pride and thirst for knowledge that drew him farther and farther away from the simple faith his mother tried to pass on to him. He dreamed of academic glory, public recognition, and human pleasures that kept him far from the practice of Christian morality. The reading of Cicero's Hortensius awakened in him a love for wisdom, but that love was still disordered because it sought truth without commitment to a virtuous life. Augustine wanted to enlighten his mind, but he was not willing to purify his heart. This contradiction would become a deep mark on his path to God. Augustine's youth was marked by choices that led him ever further into moral estrangement. His passionate temperament drew him into disordered relationships, making him live according to the desires of the senses rather than reason enlightened by faith. He sought pleasure as though it were the only way to fill the inner emptiness that accompanied him. Yet the more he surrendered to passions, the more he realized that his soul remained unsatisfied, restless, and hungry for something he could not find in the world. This insatiability, which many would interpret as a desire for freedom, was in fact the silent cry of a heart made for God. It was during this phase that Augustine encountered Manichaeism, a doctrine that promised rational and sophisticated answers to the problem of evil. Seduced by the dualistic explanation and the intellectual appearance of that philosophy, he let himself be carried along for nearly 10 years, believing he had finally found a worldview that united reason and spirituality. The doctrine, however, offered a false peace because it exempted man from moral responsibility and placed evil as something external, material, inevitable. Augustine did not yet realize that this view deeply contradicted human freedom. Even so, he embraced Manichaeism as an intellectual refuge, distancing himself even more from the Christian faith his mother so dearly desired him to embrace. During this period, Saint Monica did not give up on her son. Her tears became a living prayer, offered daily before God, pleading for the conversion of that young man who seemed so far from grace. She sought priests, bishops, and spiritual counsel, and all reaffirmed that her son was not lost, that God would still do great things with him. The perseverance of that mother became an invisible pillar in the story of Augustine's conversion. Without her tears, her vigils, and her unshakable faith, the world might never have known the Doctor of Grace. Augustine's conversion, therefore, begins mysteriously in the ardent faith of his mother. When Augustine leaves Tagaste and goes on to Carthage, his life changes radically. He plunges fully into the academic world and into the disordered life of a great city. There, he finds opportunities, temptations, and philosophical debates that feed his intellectual pride. He begins to seek human glory, believing that personal fulfillment would be the source of happiness. But within him, something remained empty. Despite his achievements, there were nights when restlessness consumed him, as if his soul were silently screaming for a meaning he still did not dare admit was missing. This emptiness, which no pleasure or praise could fill, was a secret sign of God's presence. Augustine then devotes himself to teaching, becoming a respected and ambitious rhetorician. Although he attained prestige, his soul found no rest. He sought wisdom in books, but he did not find the truth that would transform his life. He begins to notice flaws in Manichaeism, a doctrine that no longer seemed as solid to him as before. The answers that enchanted his youth now sounded superficial and insufficient before the deeper questions about the origin of evil, human freedom, and the divine nature. His soul, ever more restless, began to awaken to the possibility that truth lay beyond human philosophies. It is in this context that Augustine leaves Carthage and goes on to Rome, drawn by the desire for professional advancement. In Rome, however, he faces disappointments and realizes that human glory is unstable and deceptive. The ambition that guided him begins to lose strength, and his intellectual search intensifies. He realizes that reason, by itself, is not capable of offering definitive answers. Although he still does not embrace the Christian faith, conversion begins silently when he admits that his previous certainties are not enough. The restless soul begins to open itself to the possibility that God is the truth he had always sought without knowing it. Rome leads him to Milan, where he meets Saint Ambrose, a bishop whose intelligence and holiness deeply impress him. For the first time, Augustine finds someone who unites profound reason and authentic faith. Ambrose's homilies reveal a Christianity very different from the one Augustine had rejected in his youth. The spiritual and symbolic interpretation of the scriptures conquers his intellect. Faith, which had once seemed inferior to philosophy, now presents itself as superior wisdom. Little by little, his arrogance begins to crumble, and his soul opens to the truth. The pride that kept him distant from God begins to yield before the light of the gospel. His relationship with Ambrose is decisive for his transformation. Augustine realizes that in Christianity, there is no opposition between faith and reason, but a profound harmony. Each homily of the Bishop of Milan is like a seed cast into the heart of someone who had always sought the truth but did not know where to find it. He begins to attend church, not only to hear Ambrose's rhetoric, but to hear God speaking through his words. The inner restlessness grows, and with it the conviction that his life must change radically. Light begins to penetrate the shadows of his heart. Thus, the first part of this great story ends with Augustine as a divided man. Brilliant, but dissatisfied. Proud, but restless. Intellectual, but confused. Distant from God, yet mysteriously drawn to him. Conversion has already begun, but it has not yet manifested itself fully. It is the prelude to one of the greatest encounters in the history of the Church, an encounter that will transform not only the life of one man, but the course of all Christian spirituality. Saint Augustine's conversion did not happen suddenly, but was preceded by a profound inner drama, marked by the tension between the desire for truth and attachment to sin. He was already beginning to recognize that Christianity offered deeper answers than all the philosophies he had studied, but his heart remained bound to old habits. This division tormented him intensely, for now his mind inclined toward God, while his will insisted on remaining in the shadows. He felt that two opposing forces were confronting each other within him, and that the struggle between them was becoming increasingly painful, almost unbearable. It was the beginning of a spiritual combat that revealed with clarity that no man converts without first confronting his own inner resistance. Augustine realizes that the true battle was no longer in the search for knowledge, but in the inability to hand over his own life to the truth already recognized. He knew that God was calling, knew that the Christian faith was superior to Manichaeism and to all previous philosophies, but he feared the renunciations that conversion would require. This awareness of the spiritual cost paralyzed him, and he would later confess that he prayed to God, "Convert me, but not yet." This phrase, which would later become famous, reveals the depth of his hesitation. He wanted to be holy, but he did not want to abandon the pleasures that enslaved him. He wanted to walk with Christ, but he was not yet ready to leave the old life behind. Augustine's insecurity was fed by his vices, especially his attachment to sensuality, which he considered his greatest obstacle. His disordered life kept him bound in invisible chains, which grew stronger precisely when he began to desire freedom. Augustine understood that chastity was not a mere moral precept, but a gateway to a deeper life in the Holy Spirit. Yet that path seemed impossible to him, and he judged that he did not have the strength to change. His soul became the stage of an intense struggle between wanting and not wanting, loving and fearing, seeking God and fleeing from him at the same time. At the same time, living alongside authentic Christians increased his anguish. He saw in them an inner peace he did not possess, a coherence of life that he lacked. Many of his friends had converted and experienced a profound transformation, and this left him restless. If God had touched so many around him, why did grace seem to take so long to act in him? This question, however, concealed the uncomfortable truth that it was not God who was lacking, but he himself who still resisted. Grace was already present, but it needed to be welcomed. This realization pushed him ever closer to the abyss of the inner crisis. Saint Ambrose's preachings acted like a mirror that revealed his contradictions. While they enlightened his intelligence, they also judged his way of life. Augustine recognized that the bishop's words were not only beautiful, but true, not only arguments, but calls to conversion. And the more he recognized this truth, the more he felt the weight of his incoherence. Truth was no longer something external to him, but an inner presence that deeply disturbed him. The spiritual struggle began to intensify, as if God were gently tightening the circle of love around his soul. Augustine then begins a profound reflection on his own will. He realizes that sin is not an external force that dominates him, but a repeated choice that became habit and then slavery. This perception humbles him, because it dismantles the Manichaean justification that attributed evil to an external substance. He understands that his freedom had been used against himself, and that, to be truly free, he would need to surrender his will to the one who is truth itself. This discovery, both luminous and painful, opens a fissure in his heart that allows grace to penetrate more deeply. Saint Monica continues to accompany everything with a faith that transcends any human logic. She sees her son's inner suffering, but she does not despair. On the contrary, she intensifies her prayers, knowing that Augustine's inner combat is a sign that God has already begun to act. Her tears, far from being empty, become instruments of grace. Augustine, without realizing it, was being sustained by a spiritual strength that came from the love of a mother who had never given up on him. This silent intercession shaped the ground so that conversion could finally blossom. In the midst of this crisis, Augustine begins to read the letters of St. Paul deeply, and there he finds his own soul described with striking precision. The texts about the struggle between flesh and spirit, about the good one wants but does not do, and about the weight of sin that imprisons man, resound like truths addressed directly to him. The apostle's words not only enlighten his mind, but strike his heart with irresistible force. Conversion ceases to be merely a moral necessity and becomes an existential urgency. Despite all this inner illumination, Augustine tries to postpone the final decision. He fears losing the comfortable life he has built, fears change, fears the unknown. His fragile will wrestles between slavery and freedom, between sin and grace. He knows he can no longer turn back, for the truth has been revealed clearly, but he also fears moving forward because it would require a decisive act of renunciation. This tension reaches profound levels of spiritual suffering, marking the most painful phase of his journey toward God. At the height of his inner crisis, Augustine finally realizes that his soul is at its limit. He feels he can no longer delay his response to God's call. Truth demands a decision. The divided heart must choose between the old life and the new life. Conversion is near, but the definitive moment is still missing, the moment in which the will finally inclines toward what God desires. That sublime moment is about to happen, and the whole story seems to converge toward it. Augustine's inner crisis reaches its deepest point when he takes refuge in a garden in Milan, seeking a moment of silence to face the storm that dominated his soul. There, far from the noise of the city and the intellectual disputes that had once fascinated him, he finds himself before himself with a painful clarity. The awareness of his sins, the resistance of his will, and the urgency of the divine call intertwine within him like an overwhelming weight. For the first time, Augustine does not try to argue, explain, or rationalize his situation. He simply feels with overwhelming intensity that he is before God and that his life cannot continue as before. Tears begin to run from his eyes, not out of weakness, but out of revelation. It is as though his entire history, his errors, his passions, his philosophical searches, and his deceptions were before him, exposed to the light of truth. He realizes he can no longer flee from God, nor can he flee from himself. The words he had heard from Saint Ambrose, the counsel of Christian friends, the readings of Saint Paul, and the persistent tears of Saint Monica converge in this decisive instant. His heart becomes a battlefield where, finally, grace and pride have their final confrontation, and pride begins to yield. Augustine feels his will divided as never before. On one side, the old life cries out for continuity, pleasures, habits, passions, ambitions. On the other, God calls him with gentleness and firmness, inviting him to be reborn into a new life. He finds himself unable to choose by his own strength, as if his hands were bound to the sins that had so imprisoned him. This suffering makes him understand that conversion is not only a human decision, but a divine gift that must be welcomed with humility. Surrender draws near. In the midst of this torment, Augustine cries out to God with a silent shout, "How long, Lord? How long will I keep saying, 'Tomorrow, tomorrow'? Why not now?" This cry marks the definitive break with the excuses that for years had fed his indecision. He understands that spiritual procrastination is one of the soul's greatest dangers, and that every delay reinforces the chains of sin. His tears multiply, and his inner voice breaks. For the first time, Augustine recognizes himself as small before the greatness of God, and powerless before the weight of his own sin. It is in this moment of pain and truth that something unexpected happens. Augustine hears a voice coming from a nearby house, the voice of a boy or girl, repeatedly singing the phrase, "Take and read, take and read." At first, he wonders whether it has any meaning, but the phrase repeats with serene force, as if it were a divine command disguised in the simplicity of a child's song. He immediately understands that it is no coincidence. That mysterious call touches his soul with a precision no human word could achieve. It is God speaking to his heart through an unexpected instrument. Augustine quickly turns to the scriptures that were nearby. He opens them at random, not out of superstition, but as one obeying a direct call from providence. His eyes fall upon a passage from the letter to the Romans that speaks of abandoning the works of the flesh and putting on Christ. Each word seems to pierce his soul like a blade of light, separating past from future, the old man from the new man. He understands that God is speaking to him in that instant, in an absolutely personal way. There is no more room for doubt, nor for postponing what must be done. The reading of St. Paul's words produces an immediate transformation in his heart. He describes that moment as the instant when the light of divine confidence flooded his soul, and all the darkness of hesitation disappeared. The inner struggle ceases as if it had never existed, replaced by a deep and indescribable peace. The will that had seemed fragile and divided now becomes whole, inclined entirely toward God. Conversion happens not by human effort, but by the direct action of grace. It is the birth of a new man. Augustine rises as someone who has just awakened from a long spiritual sleep. Tears continue to flow, but now they are tears of joy and liberation. The burden he carried in his heart vanishes, replaced by a lightness he had never experienced. He feels that he has finally found what he had sought throughout his life. Not a philosophical idea, not a sophisticated theory, but a person, Christ. The encounter with God becomes his new identity, and total surrender marks the beginning of a new life. He returns to his friend Alypius, who immediately perceives the change in Augustine's countenance. The convert recounts what happened, and Alypius, touched by the same grace, also embraces the Christian life with decision. The Garden of Milan becomes holy ground, not because of the place, but because there God descended to the deepest part of a soul to transform it forever. There took place one of the greatest conversions in history, nourished by truth, by grace, and by tears that God gathered as prayer. The news of Augustine's conversion reaches Saint Monica, who sees her decades of prayer finally bloom. The faith of that mother, so often misunderstood, is revealed as an instrument of providence. Augustine recognizes that his conversion is not only the fruit of his search, but also of the fidelity of the one who never gave up on seeing him saved. It is the beginning of a new path which will lead him to baptism, to holiness, and to the luminous role he will occupy in the history of the Church. After the decisive experience in the Garden of Milan, Augustine understands that his inner conversion must now be sealed by a sacramental act that will definitively mark his entry into the life of Christ. He does not desire a superficial change, but a deep and complete transformation. Therefore, he decides to prepare seriously for baptism, aware that this sacrament is not merely a symbolic rite, but a true death to the old life and a birth to the new life. This decision, though taken with firmness, does not fail to provoke fear and reverence in his heart, for he knows that nothing will be as before. Conversion is no longer only an idea, but a reality that demands total surrender. Preparation for baptism takes place under the guidance of Saint Ambrose, who accompanies Augustine with paternal wisdom. The words of the holy bishop continue to illuminate his path and strengthen his determination. Augustine learns that baptism is not the end of conversion, but the beginning of a life entirely dedicated to God. He realizes that he must purify his thoughts, order his affections, and establish new priorities. The light that had once only illuminated his mind now extends to his behavior, his gaze, and his daily choices. He begins to experience an inner joy he had never felt, as though he had finally found the deepest meaning of existence. Renunciation of old habits becomes an essential part of this process. Augustine understands that he cannot bring into the new life the vices that marked his youth. The struggle for chastity, which once seemed impossible to him, now becomes a path he embraces with courage, sustained by grace. He recognizes that true freedom is born of obedience to God, and that disordered pleasures so valued in the past were in truth chains that prevented him from being fully human. This discovery fills him with humility and makes him realize the greatness of divine mercy that transformed his weakness into spiritual strength. The moment of baptism arrives during the Easter Vigil, the sacred night on which the Church celebrates the resurrection of Christ. Augustine, alongside his son Adeodatus and his friend Alypius, receives from the hands of Saint Ambrose the sacrament that will forever change the course of his life. The baptismal water touches his head as a visible sign of the invisible grace that has transformed him inwardly. He feels that the old man is drowned in that water and that a new man emerges, illuminated by the light of Christ. The emotion of that instant surpasses any previous experience, for he realizes that he now belongs entirely to God. After baptism, the peace that floods his heart is deep and lasting. He experiences a spiritual freedom that no philosophy had been able to offer. The restlessness that marked his entire adult life vanishes like smoke, replaced by a serenity that springs from the certainty of the truth found. Grace not only healed his wounds, but expanded his capacity to love, understand, and serve. Augustine realizes that God not only called him, but had prepared him from childhood for this moment of definitive encounter. Life after baptism demands new choices. Augustine decides to abandon his career as a teacher of rhetoric, even though it was a profession that guaranteed him prestige and stability. He understands that he cannot continue instructing others in arts that so often served pride and human vanity. His conversion must be coherent in all aspects, including work and way of life. This renunciation is painful but necessary. He no longer wants to be a master of words, but a servant of the eternal word he found in Christ. In this decisive period, the death of Saint Monica also occurs, an event that, though painful, seals his conversion in a sublime way. Monica, who spent her entire life praying for her son's salvation, sees her desire finally fulfilled before departing for eternity. The final dialogue between them at Ostia, filled with mystical depth, reveals the spiritual communion that mother and son reached after so many years of tears and hope. Her death does not cast Augustine into despair, but consolidates his faith, for he knows that now he has in heaven an intercessor who will continue to accompany him. Augustine returns to Africa profoundly transformed. He no longer desires a life of worldly glory, but a simple life devoted to prayer, study, and fraternal communion. Forming a small community with friends, he decides to live as a monk, cultivating the humility that had so long been lacking in him. The brilliant intelligence that once served pride now becomes an instrument of contemplation and service to God. His desire is to live hidden with Christ, far from the ambitions that had dominated him in the past. Augustine does not see the renunciation of his former life as loss, but as liberation. He realizes that true wealth lies in living in the light of truth, and that the peace he found cannot be compared to any earthly pleasure. This perception strengthens him to face the challenges still to come. Conversion, far from being an isolated event, becomes a way of life, renewed daily by grace and personal fidelity. He becomes an example that, when God takes possession of a soul, nothing can remain as before. Thus, Augustine's post-baptismal phase reveals the birth of a new man, purified, strengthened, and entirely surrendered to the divine will. The conversion that began in restlessness and became concrete in the garden now manifests itself in a life completely oriented by Christ. It is the flowering of a soul that has finally found its true rest, God. And from this point on, Augustine is ready to assume an even greater role within the Church, leaving behind not only a conquered past, but a luminous future. After his return to Africa, Augustine did not imagine that God had prepared for him a path that would lead him to pastoral service and spiritual leadership in the Church. His initial desire was to live a withdrawn life, dedicated to contemplation, to the study of Scripture, and to fraternal communion with the brothers who shared the same pursuit of holiness. However, Providence was calling him to something greater. His intelligence, his newly acquired humility, and his profound experience of conversion made him a precious instrument to enlighten and guide the people of God. The one who had once fled from truth was now ready to proclaim it with courage and wisdom. The community of faith in Hippo quickly recognized Augustine's spiritual depth and called him to the priestly ministry. He resisted at first, not out of fear, but out of humility, considering himself unworthy of such a task. He felt that his turbulent past and former sins made him unfit to lead other souls. Yet the Church itself, which is God's instrument, confirmed his calling, showing him that grace is able to transform even the frailest into shepherds after the heart of Christ. Thus, Augustine was ordained a priest and, later, Bishop of Hippo. As a bishop, Augustine undertook with seriousness and love the mission of caring for his flock. He devoted himself tirelessly to preaching, catechesis, and the spiritual accompaniment of the faithful. His homilies, profound and accessible, became instruments of conversion for many. He spoke not only with theological authority, but with personal witness, for he knew the darkness of sin and the transforming power of grace. When Augustine spoke of mercy, he spoke as one who had experienced it in his own flesh. When he spoke of freedom, he spoke as one who had been set free by the truth. Augustine also became a firm defender of the faith against the heresies that threatened the unity of the Church. Among the most striking challenges were Manichaeism, which he knew deeply, Donatism, which divided African Christians, and Pelagianism, which denied the need for grace. His intellectual capacity, once used in worldly disputes, was now placed entirely at the service of Christ. In his writings and debates, he showed that true freedom is only possible through the action of grace, and that the human being, wounded by original sin, depends entirely on God to attain salvation. His doctrinal clarity shaped Western theology for the centuries that followed. Augustine's pastoral work was not limited to combating heresies. He cared for the poor, visited the sick, pacified conflicts, and promoted justice. His house was open to those in need, and he lived simply, seeking no luxury or privileges. The one who once sought human glory now became a servant of all. His conversion had not been merely an inner change, but a concrete commitment to a life that mirrored the gospel. He understood that the bishop was, above all, a spiritual father, and he exercised that role with love and tireless dedication. The experience of his own conversion made him a compassionate guide for sinners. Augustine did not treat the weak harshly, for he knew how long God had been patient with him. He welcomed those who, like him, struggled against vices and sought liberation. His counsel was firm, but always full of mercy, reminding everyone that there is no sin so great that the grace of God cannot forgive it. This pastoral vision made his figure beloved by both the simple and the intellectual, because he united truth and charity in a balanced way. At the same time, his love for contemplation did not disappear. Augustine continued to devote long hours to the study of God's Word, to silent prayer, and to deep reflection on the mysteries of faith. His literary work flourished during this period, giving rise to texts that would become pillars of Christian spirituality. In every work, he sought not only to explain the truth, but to lead souls closer to God. His writing was not purely theological, but deeply spiritual, marked by an unceasing pursuit of divine love. His monastic community continued to flourish under his guidance. Augustine taught that community life was a school of charity, where each brother shaped the other through patience, humility, and kindness. He saw common life as a portrait of the Church, where all share their weaknesses and walk together toward holiness. The man who once was dominated by pride now became a defender of humility as the sure path to God. It was living proof that true conversion transforms the heart and the entire life. Augustine's presence as pastor, theologian, and monk reinforced the perception that his conversion had been prepared by God himself for the good of the Church. His witness reached not only Hippo, but all of Christendom. His spiritual authority did not come from titles, but from the coherence between what he preached and what he lived. Augustine became, day by day, a beacon that illuminated the path of Christians and inspired a deeper search for divine truth. Thus, the convert becomes a missionary, the sinner becomes a saint, the proud rhetorician becomes a teacher of humility. Augustine's conversion not only saved his soul, but guided entire generations to God. It is the triumph of grace, the victory of mercy, and the testimony that God can transform any heart that truly opens itself to His presence. As his ministry and spiritual life advanced, Augustine felt an inner impulse to narrate his journey of sin, restlessness, and encounter with God. This was not a desire for self-promotion or to become famous, but a profound movement of gratitude and humility before divine mercy. Thus arises one of the most important works in the history of Christian spirituality, the Confessions. In them, Augustine writes not as a philosopher, rhetorician, or bishop, but as a son who recognizes the Father's love in every moment of his life, from childhood to the moment of his conversion. It is a book written before God and for God, where every word reveals a heart that has finally found rest in eternal truth. The Confessions are not merely an autobiographical account. They form a profound prayer in which Augustine speaks with God about everything he lived through. He does not hide his weaknesses, his errors, or his disordered passions. On the contrary, he exposes every fall with sincerity to show the power of grace. By revealing his own misery, he exalts divine mercy, which transformed a restless heart into a heart inflamed with love for Christ. What most impresses is the radical honesty with which he presents himself before the Lord. Without masks, without justifications, only with the naked truth that frees and heals. This sincerity would be, for future generations, a model of how the soul must place itself before God. In his reflections, Augustine shows that God was never absent, even when he voluntarily distanced himself. He recalls how he sought happiness in pleasures, intellectual glory, and false doctrines, and how all these pursuits left him ever more empty. The famous phrase, "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you," summarizes his spiritual experience. The human heart, created for God, finds peace only when it returns to its origin and its ultimate end. This truth, which he discovered after so many wanderings, became the center of his doctrine, and a beacon for those who were also seeking meaning in life. The work also reveals the divine pedagogy that leads the soul along mysterious paths toward conversion. Augustine recognizes that even his errors were permitted by God so that he might understand the greatness of the love that awaited him at the moment of his return. Nothing in his life was wasted. Every tear, every restlessness, every philosophical search, and even every sin became a step toward grace. This understanding fills him with deep humility, for he realizes that it was not his intelligence nor his willpower that led him to Christ, but the infinite patience of God, who accompanied him at every step. Another impressive aspect of the Confessions is the way Augustine describes the transformation of his vision of the world. Before, he saw everything with proud eyes, seeking to dominate reality through reason. Later, he comes to see creation as a reflection of divine goodness and the human being as the Creator's masterpiece, called to communion with him. Grace not only changes his morality, but purifies his gaze, making him capable of contemplating the world with humility and wonder. This new spiritual vision would profoundly shape Christian theology in the centuries that followed. The sincerity with which Augustine narrates his inner struggle against sin also gives hope to the faithful. He describes his vices, his fears, and his inability to change without divine help, showing that no sinner should despair. If God could transform his life dominated by passions and errors, then he can transform any soul that opens itself to his grace. Thus, the Confessions become a spiritual remedy for all who feel unworthy of God's love. Augustine teaches that grace does not require perfection, but availability. It does not require strength, but surrender. At the same time, the work unmasks the illusions of pride and self-sufficiency. Augustine recalls clearly how he believed he could attain happiness through his own intelligence, and how that path led him to suffering and frustration. His conversion shows that true wisdom is not in considering oneself great, but in recognizing oneself as small before God. Humility, so opposed by Roman culture, becomes a central virtue in his spirituality. He understands that only the one who abandons the ego and surrenders to the divine will becomes truly free. The Confessions, however, are not limited to narrating the past. Augustine also reflects on his present life as a bishop, showing that conversion is not an isolated event, but a continuous process. He speaks of his inner difficulties, his temptations, and his pastoral responsibilities, revealing that the journey toward God is permanent. Holiness is not the absence of struggle, but constant fidelity in spiritual combat. This balanced and realistic vision of the Christian life would be decisive in forming generations of saints and doctors. The impact of this work crossed geographic boundaries and historical eras. Philosophers, theologians, mystics, and simple faithful found in it light for their own spiritual searches. Augustine's words echo through the centuries because they speak directly to the human soul, revealing its miseries and its greatness. He thus becomes not only a convert, but a master of conversion. His witness demonstrates that divine grace, when accepted, turns the impossible into reality and makes of the restless heart a heart ordered by the love of God. Thus, the Confessions are far more than a book. They are a bridge between the human soul and divine mercy. In them, we see how God acts silently in each person's history and how the conversion of a single man can illuminate the entire world. Augustine's life becomes a beacon, a guide, and a consolation for all who seek God amid the shadows of the world. The greatest conversion of all did not remain only in the saint's heart, but became the spiritual heritage of the entire Church. When we contemplate the whole spiritual trajectory of Saint Augustine, we realize that his conversion was not merely a moral or intellectual change, but a true resurrection of the soul. His entire life, from the restlessness of youth to the decisive encounter with God, reveals the patient action of divine grace, which transforms the human heart step by step. There is no moment, however dark it may have been, that was not reached by God's mercy. Augustine's story shows that God never gives up on his children, and that no soul is too far away to be led back to the truth. His conversion is living testimony that divine love is stronger than any sin. Reflecting on his own transformation, Augustine recognizes that God sought him even when he fled. There were phases in which he surrendered to passions, false philosophical systems, and pride, but God accompanied him silently, waiting for the opportune moment to touch him definitively. He realizes that every restlessness, every dissatisfaction with worldly pleasures, and every intellectual disappointment was, in fact, a call of grace. Conversion, therefore, was not an abrupt rupture, but the outcome of a long path of inner preparation guided by God. This vision of providence becomes one of the pillars of his theology. The figure of Saint Monica plays an essential role in this process. Augustine's conversion is also the fruit of the tears, supplications, and perseverance of a holy mother who fully trusted in the power of God. Monica never gave up on her son, even when everything seemed lost. She believed in the divine promise and remained steadfast in prayer for more than 30 years. Her silent intercession shows the world that the prayer of a faithful soul can change destinies and open doors that, humanly speaking, would seem closed. Monica's holiness intertwines with Augustine's holiness, and her participation in her son's conversion is proof that no one is saved alone. Augustine's conversion also has an ecclesial dimension. His transformation does not remain restricted to the interior of the soul, but expands to serve the Church. He becomes bishop, doctor, spiritual guide, and defender of the faith in times of great doctrinal confusion. The one who once sought truth alone now becomes a teacher for all Christendom. His life demonstrates that true conversion is never individualistic. It transforms the convert into a witness, a missionary, and an instrument of salvation for others. The grace God pours upon one heart multiplies when that heart surrenders itself entirely to the service of the Church. The depth of his conversion makes Saint Augustine a model for all times. He was not born a saint. He did not live an exemplary youth. He was not spared grave temptations. On the contrary, he experienced the force of sin and human fragility in all their intensity. And that is precisely what makes him so close to us. He reveals that holiness is not the fruit of natural perfection, but of grace that finds space to act in a sincere and repentant heart. Augustine thus becomes a beacon for all sinners who believe they are too far from God. His life proclaims that it is precisely in such cases that mercy manifests itself with greater splendor. The saint's conversion also teaches us that true freedom consists in surrendering oneself to God. For years, Augustine believed that freedom was doing whatever he pleased, without limits, guided only by the impulses of the will. But this led him to the slavery of vices and to existential emptiness. When he finds Christ, he discovers that full freedom is the capacity to choose the good, to love what is eternal, and to live according to the truth. Conversion, therefore, did not bind him. On the contrary, it freed him from everything that imprisoned him. His story is proof that obedience to God is not oppression, but relief. Another striking aspect of his conversion is the central role of humility. Once proud, vain, and confident in his intelligence, Augustine learns that true wisdom begins when man recognizes his smallness before God. He understands that reason, when not illuminated by faith, is incapable of reaching the fullness of truth. This humility not only changes his life, but shapes all his theological work, especially when he speaks of grace. For Augustine, everything comes from God, everything is sustained by God, and everything returns to God. No one is saved by one's own strength. All depend radically on mercy. Augustine's conversion, however, does not end in the Garden of Milan, nor at baptism, nor at his priestly ordination. It continues throughout his entire life, renewed daily by prayer, charity, and the fight against temptations. He understands that conversion is a continuous process, a constant dynamic of spiritual growth, a yes renewed each day. His whole life becomes a response of love to the one who loved him first. This final perseverance is proof that true conversion is not an isolated event, but a way of life. At the end of his days, Augustine contemplates all that God has done in his soul and recognizes that the greatest conversion of all is the one that transforms the human heart into the dwelling place of the Most High. He realizes that his own story is only a reflection of the divine love that can do all things. Like him, all are invited to open their hearts so that God may enter and completely renew life. His conversion thus becomes a universal call to every Christian. God never stops seeking us, even when we distance ourselves from him, and he is always ready to transform our hearts if we let him act. Thus, the life of Saint Augustine shines through the centuries as testimony to the limitless power of grace. His journey, marked by falls, searches, and reunions, reveals that God writes straight even through the most crooked lines of the human soul. The greatest conversion of all is not only his, but the one God desires to accomplish in each of us, leading us from restlessness to rest, from disorder to peace, from sin to holiness. May his example inspire all those who still walk in darkness, remembering that the light of truth is always near for those who have the courage to open their hearts.